Welcome, everyone, to the last in our series of four webinars in our Affordable Multifamily Retrofit series. Appreciate you guys making time to join us today. Construction is really where it all comes together, right? We've covered a lot over the last few sessions, which I will recap shortly. And thanks, as always, to LADWP for the support in helping us share what we are learning, and really credit to Adalia Rodriguez, who will be carrying the ball today. And she is leading some really groundbreaking work at East LA Community Corporation. So next slide, please. My name is Dave Hodgins. Oh, here we go. So background and contract context. Why construction management matters, right? We're working in occupied buildings, people's homes. So this is something that deserves a lot of thought. And so pre, during, and closeout, this is a theme across all of the sessions that we've held. Measure twice, cut once, right? And stuff will still happen, stuff will still come up, and Adalia's got some great stories, and she's navigated it all beautifully and gracefully. But pre, during, post, getting super clear on roles and responsibilities. This is something, right? Lessons learned, still being learned. Each project is different, but we think that the collective efforts of ELAC and the other Retrofit LA cohort members are really valuable to share. And so we're really happy to have this platform. And thanks again for LADWP for the support on this. And then we'll have some time for questions. So I'll try to get through this. As I started to say, I'm Dave Hodgins. Sustento is our organization. We help to kind of guide the Retrofit LA effort, but that's really brought to life right by our cohort members like ELAC. It also includes Little Tokyo Service Center and Esperanza Community Housing, who are doing this work on the ground. So it's my job, and it's a fun one to try to see what are we learning, what are we running into, what are ways forward, and just facilitate that collective learning and impact. So I think we're going to do a quick poll. It's an intimate group today, but if you could just let us know, how do you come to this work? That just helps us understand who's here, and maybe tailor our comments or understand where your questions are coming from. Great. And are we able to show the results? Okay, a good spread. Excellent. Thanks, Danny, and thank you guys for that. So, zooming out, why does this matter? We've been talking, those of us that have been in the decarb space for a long time, right? I think we've missed the point that this is part of a broader effort that connects to a lot of other issues. And Adalia and our other cohort members have really helped me see this. It's about affordable housing affordability. We've got buildings that are aging. Meanwhile, we've been working on this, and the climate has changed. Extreme heat is the number one public health risk that we have to think about now in LA. It used to be air pollution. We still got that going for us. Utility bills, and affordability of utility bills in addition to rent, or if you're able to buy a home. And then, regulation is trying to help the market focus, bringing incentives as well as financing, so access to funding. Tenant safety ties back to the health piece. So this is all connected. And what we can call decarbonization upgrades is really, if we take the label off, it's mechanical, electrical, plumbing, new appliances that are more efficient and cleaner. And so that's better for residents, better for communities. But I think it's important to hold this work in context. And Adalia may share some of the things, that tenants ask for. So one thing I say is, like, we can't come in and just talk about heat pumps and ignore, right, other really obvious issues that tenants are going to care about, like, hey, I want a new dishwasher, right? That actually happened. And so really holding this in context and not thinking that that it's just an isolated thing, or oh, this is even the most important thing. It's a thing amongst many. So this is a flow chart that we line out in our field guide. You got the key components of this, which we've covered in the webinars, are live online now. This module will go onto retrofit.la, which is our website, following today. But so you have a visual of the major steps in the process as we see it currently. And today we'll be focusing on construction. So now, enough from me. I'll hand it over to Adalia Rodriguez with East LA Community Corporation, who will be leading us through lessons learned from the projects she's implemented so successfully and some she's got live. Adalia, thanks for making time.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everybody. So glad to be here with you today. I'm Adalia Rodriguez, Vice President of Human Capital and Chief Operating Officer here at ELAC, East LA Community Corporation. Um, we can go to the next slide. So, like Dave shared, I'll be talking about why occupied rehab is different, and I've really clustered it into three different categories, which is protect the residents, protect your asset, and protect your incentives. And this all ties to the rehab of our projects that we consider decarbonization. These are the projects that are within our existing portfolio that we are trying to upgrade that have aged. And so I'll share some insights. And when I think about this role or this topic, it really comes to mind that you've got to think about your audience, that's your residents, and you've got to make sure you have the right team and you really have to have a strong communication process. So we'll go through and I'll share. So first off, protect your residents. Like Dave said, this is occupied rehab. We didn't plan any relocation in any of our projects. And luckily, we've been able to manage that. Relocation is costly, and so we were working around them. And what that means is we need to minimize the disruptions that we're causing to their life, right? We need to make sure that the residents we're communicating in the way that works best for them. There was a prior presentation that we did that touched on resident engagement. And in that presentation, we shared different strategies for communicating, but it's always good to ask the tenants what is the best way of communicating with you, and it won't always just be one format. Um, and you got to make sure that at the end of the day, you're restoring their essential services, water, power, heat. We need to make sure there's quiet hours and we need to ensure that proper notices are happening. When you think about protecting your asset, what you're thinking about is, these assets have aged. Most of them have in the affordable housing portfolio, there's very little resources to replace this old equipment. And in many cases, our maintenance cost is significantly higher and keeps growing because the infrastructure and the plumbing, mechanical engineering, all of that is older. Um, when it relates to decarbonization, construction is not the standard. LADBS is your only inspector. In this case, it requires a massive coordination. You're working with your incentive program implementers, you're working with your utility agencies, and you're even working with the incentive programs directly, plus the LADBS. And each of them will require their own inspections and will also require different types of on-site visits and testing. And when you're thinking about protecting your incentives, this just means that you're getting resources to go beyond the basic repairs and investing in more comprehensive upgrades. While you're doing that, you're likely stacking multiple incentives. In our case, we stacked about four different incentives, and each of them have equipment specification minimum requirements. And so making sure that you're putting in the right equipment to meet the incentive guidelines makes sure that your project is financially feasible, you're limiting your financial risk, and you're also creating that long-term reliability for our tenants. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I want to start preparing you about how to plan for your construction before it starts. I'm thinking maybe 6 months beforehand. There are several things that need to happen in a decarbonization construction project. We need to start with benchmarking. That actually needs to start 6 months before. That's a requirement of many of the incentive programs, and our incentive program implementers can help us do that. But that should start as soon as possible. You also want to understand the electrical load capacity of your existing building. There are some resources, and actually we probably should have listed them here. There are resources available to understand that, but I think the most important part is to know, go to your electrical panel, take photos, know how much existing electrical capacity the building has, and electrical capacity that each unit has, and that'll help inform what upgrades need to happen later on. In our case, we do have properties that are older than that are pre-1980 properties. And so in that case, you want to consider environmental and structural testing. We typically do lead and asbestos testing for those older properties so that if construction is happening, we're addressing that. And we're making sure that the contractor is doing it in the most appropriate way. And then in some cases, older buildings also have weight capacity on the roof. And you want to find those out before you're planning your project. Same thing goes for your fire rating. Know what your existing fire rating is to plan for restoration or upgrades. Most buildings that are older are not currently meeting building code. And so when you're doing these various testing, you're also making sure that you're planning and incorporating that into your construction scope of work. There are other important things that you should know as an owner, like where are the shut-off locations for your water, gas, and electrical. A lot of times the property manager has that, but your project manager is going to need that, and your asset manager, and you'll be the ones, those roles are the ones working more closely with the contractor, so it's good for them to know where that is as well. And then other things that we ran into is contractors need a restroom, and contractors also need on-site storage. Um, many times a contractor can have or include as part of their bid on-site storage, but if it's accessible, if there's options already existing in the building, it also helps to save costs. And the
Dahlia, can
final
I
thing,
interrupt you for one
yeah.
second? Um, I, I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, so this is all coming up in the context of decarb, but I love the point of the way you phrased it, understanding the realities. Um, I think, would you say it's true that sort of this work is sort of understanding the realities is a good thing to do, whether or not you're doing decarb is to understand all this stuff, so that, when you're planning to do anything with the building, that you kind of understand all these parameters. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
also just wanted to acknowledge the way that this point about, providing restrooms and storage space for the contractors. It's like there's some saying like, amateurs talk, you know, vision, professionals talk logistics, and you are a professional.
You did. And the yeah, and because we're talking about occupied rehab in older buildings, it's more important if we haven't, as owners, taken the lead in understanding this, that we know it at this point because we're the ones financing the scope of work and engaging the parties. And so that means that the new equipment that is going to be installed. So one of the things with decarbonization is that a lot of it is new technology. And I say new technology, but the reality is heat pump systems and some of these things have been around. But for us as affordable housing, it's not the stuff that we've been putting into our existing buildings. Um, and so this new equipment has special requirements. In some cases, in most cases, heat pump generates condensation, and being able to make sure that we can get rid of it also might create um, a different way of designing or how we place the equipment or the type of equipment that we get for our properties. I know that for ELAC, a couple of issues that came up was for the heat pump water heaters in our closets. We had to make sure that there was a place for the water to release, and we did have that, but that setup hadn't been used in a very long time, so there was clogging. So it's also making sure that you're looking at your existing infrastructure and making sure that it's working properly. Um, Identifying the right consultants is all relates to assessing before you bid. You'll have to have environmental consultant, an architect, an electrical engineer, and then you'll want a general contractor. When you're picking your general contractor, you'll want to make sure that their expertise comes with a lot of trades. It's ideal that they have their own staff. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll start to help prepare like the timeline. So you're thinking 6 months before you're assessing your building, you're understanding the existing conditions. Now you're at a place where you want to start identifying and drilling down on that scope of work. And once you've assessed your building, you'll know, okay, what's the electrical capacity on my building, or what is the infrastructure, the weight capacity of my roof? Can it hold the equipment or the project that I'm planned? That's when you get into permitting timelines. I bring this up really early on because our incentives also come with very strict timelines. So if your incentive has a timeline where the work needs to be completed within 4 months, you're likely going to have to go with some scope of work that is an over-the-counter permit process where it requires no plan check. But if you want a deeper type of scope of work and you're upgrading your full electrical panel in the building, and possibly you might even need to bring more electrical capacity to a building. You're probably looking at 6 months to get through that permit phase. So then you need to align your incentives to that. So what we see is 6 to 8 weeks for over-the-counter permits, 12 to 16 weeks when you need to go through full plan check, and over 6 months when you need to engage your utility services. This is really important to know as you're thinking through your work because your incentives are going to have that also a different timeline. There was a property that we did, our Vallejo property, 100-year-old building. The electrical capacity of that building was at 200 amps. We needed 600 to get this work done, which meant that that timeline was going to be pushed out at a longer period. And in this case, we did have incentives kind of backing up with us. So it just took a lot more coordination to make sure we were meeting those requirements. Um, let's go to the next slide. Assess your building, you know the permitting process, the timelines. Now you're ready to develop your scope of work. Typically at ELAC, the way that we develop our scope of work is we align all of our incentives to the available funding that we have. If we were only able to secure $700,000 in incentives, our scope of work will be $700,000. Um, and we do this because we want to get started. We want to make sure that we're able to keep moving and take advantage of resources, and we're not creating a greater gap on our properties. That's the way that we're aligning it. Others can align in a different way, but for us, it means that each incentive program does have minimum requirements. And so we're closely looking at that equipment and the types of equipment that we're putting into the project. And then the way that we're going to permit and push out our scope of work. So we also require, when we're developing our scope of work, that we're asking any potential contractor to bid at our site. When we first started doing this work, we invited three different contractors to start building a relationship with them. We knew we were going to have a larger pipeline of projects. And for us, it was a way of starting to engage multiple people and helping us move more of our projects into this process, into decarbonizing them, but we did want to require that they all visit the sites. And the reason is not every unit is the same, not every property is the same. And then a more accurate way of understanding your costs is if the contractor has actually been able to go and see its existing conditions and verify it on their own. When they're walking your site and when you're walking your site, you also want to look at any other potential issues that you might have. We tend to look when we're thinking about this work, we tend to do a full site visit where we're looking to see if there's any flooding, any deck damaging, any issues in units that any electrical issues in units where things are not working properly. Um, and we ask the bidders to take a look at that as well, so they can raise their concerns and give us their feedback. But most of the time, the contractors are very, very familiar with different projects, different sites. They've seen a lot of this, and they know different strategies to mediate or help you address it, and they can also offer that, and it also helps you understand what your potential scope of work is going to be if you're limited to your incentive funding. When we do all of our site visits, we also take pre-construction photos. You want to make sure that if you're going into a property, doing a full site visit with yourself or the contractors, you don't necessarily have to come back frequently, that you're using your time wisely, doing this one at once and taking as much information and as much notes as you can at that time. Because remember, this is occupied rehab and we want to minimize the daily disruption that we're causing to our tenants. We also engage our tenants in pre-construction planning. So we have conversations. They understand why we're at their site, why the contractors are at their site. They know that it's not a for sure, but it's something that we're planning, and we're also asking them for their feedback on how their current equipment is working, or if they have seen any other issues on the property, because they're the ones on the property every day, living in the space, and they understand it many times better than we do. When you're also developing your scope of work, consider the equipment procurement times. There is some equipment because we order in bulk. Sometimes we order 50 ACs, 50 heat pump water heaters if they're in unit. They may be out like 30 days, 60 days. So you also want to make sure that your understanding the timeframes of some of the different equipment. And then again, know your incentive timelines. When it relates to decarbonization, this work requires a lot of documentation. These are what the incentive programs want in order to close out and pay you out. So they need pre-construction photos of all of your water heaters, and your AC systems. And what they want to know is the brand, the model, and they want photos, date stamped, which are the pullback views and the serial number views. Um, so next slide. So you have an idea of your scope of work. Now you want to select a contractor. You have a group of contractors that you could work with. In affordable housing, all of our work typically needs to have a bidding process in order to tap into our replacement reserves. So when you're selecting a contractor, you want to ask them, do you have occupied rehab experience and can you prove it, right? So you want to make sure you've vetted that, you've asked others who have worked with them, and that you've seen some successful projects. You also want to make sure that these contractors have some financial stability. These incentive programs are slow to reimburse and they may have to float costs. You could limit the amount of time they float costs, but you also want to understand what are they able to and for how long. And then you want to know how do they respond to defects or warranty issues. All the equipment comes with warranty. Most of the time, labor is only for a year. The equipment can be 10 years or greater, but you want to know, will your contractor be responsive if you're having warranty issues shortly after construction or during the construction timeframe? This is where I mentioned that it's helpful to have a contractor that has multiple trades, because a contractor that has their own staff and their own staff that are knowledgeable in electrical, plumbing, or all those areas can easily or more quickly come out to address your issues rather than them having to call another subcontractor. And then you want a contractor that's got some great communication, and that they're following your communication protocols. We'll go into that in a minute, but you don't want the contractor working with tenants. You don't want the contractor, not communicating thoroughly to everybody. So you want to set those expectations early, but you want to be able to know that they've had this success. So you want to ask other people that have worked with them. In our case for ELAC, we not only wanted the contractor to be skilled with occupied rehab, we also wanted to make sure that our contractor had experience working with vulnerable populations and wasn't afraid of helping people go that extra mile if they needed to carry stuff out of their unit or move it around. We needed the contractors to be able and willing to do that. Next slide, please. So I shared earlier that roles and responsibilities is really, really important here. It's one of the key components to making sure that your construction is successful, and that the construction management is happening the way that you intended it to be. So for us, there's 4 different roles that are important. There's the project manager, the property manager, the general contractor, and then the asset manager or the owner. For the role of the project manager, and you know what, we may have put PM throughout this slide, so I'll clarify when we see just PM. For project manager, this is really the central person to all these parties. This person is managing the general contractor. They're scheduling the construction plan with the general contractor. They're managing cost, budget, processing invoices, and possibly relocation if needed. But this person is their day to day is making sure that the construction is happening smoothly. The property manager should serve as the single point of contact for the tenants. You don't want the project manager talking with the tenants. You don't want the contractor talking with the tenants directly. You want one person that is a trusted person to your tenants, and that should be your property manager. They should be managing all of the tenant communication, the notices that are going out. They should be the person calling tenants if there is something urgent happening. And they should be also monitoring that the contractor is closing each day site with the tenants having all their essentials, power, water, heating. Um, the general contractor is responsible for the construction. They are complying with the project rules. They're making sure that the equipment is performing, that they've got equipment approval. They're meeting the incentive program requirements when it relates to prevailing wage and apprentices. And they're also scheduling any updates or providing proper notice to project manager and property manager if utility shutoffs need to happen or there's a change, happens to be a change in the schedule. The ownership or asset management are ultimately the decision makers. If any relocation is needed, they're approving that, and they're the key people that are managing risk. Tenant communication, again, I shared all, when you think about it's all tenant communication should be happening with property manager, and property manager should be informing the rest of the parties. We use a standard template for our notices. It's the same template when we have our tenant meetings pre-construction. We let our tenants know this is the notice that we're going to be using. We'll post it on your door when it's your time frame, but we'll regularly have meetings with our tenants every month or every couple months, depending on the length of the construction period, and we'll project out which area of the building we'll be at, so they'll have a general idea of when to anticipate notices. Next slide, please. Tenant habitability plans. This is required for any building that's occupied. This is something that the general contractor does. I put this here because this is really one of the most important things that our general contractor should be able to do 6 months, possibly 3 months before they start construction. And they should be able to convince LADWP that their approach keeps units habitable. The goal is to minimize costs and minimize the disruption to our tenants. Tenant habitability plans should be able to lay out how water is going to be restored at the end of the day, how power will be restored, and if there are any punctures in the walls or holes that had to be created because you're doing work that the contractor is able to demonstrate that those will be sealed in some form before they leave for the day. These are the standards that LAHD has. And you want to make sure that that contractor has walked that through with you and they've convinced you so that they can also convince your LAHD. There's also another thing is that you want to talk to your contractor about boundaries. In our case, we were very clear they should not be using tenant restrooms. This is, of course, common sense, but you also just want to spell it out. So earlier when I shared crews should have a restroom on site, they're going to need something, whether the contractor gets a porta potty on site or there's a restroom, a common area restroom that they can use, but it needs to be verbally shared and needs to be written in the contract that they cannot use your tenant restrooms. Next slide, please. So we have a poll here for you all. The poll is what pre-construction issue has caused the biggest delay on your projects? Select all that apply.
Right. What we see. Hmm. Unknown conditions. Yep. Yeah. And just a quick comment on this, there are pretty broadly accepted standards for like energy audits, for example, but those were developed before we were really trying to do more electrification. And so the assessment of the building infrastructure is not standard practice. So I think a theme, that Adalia's been hitting is we shouldn't assume that things are common sense. We really spell it out in the RFP and in the agreement.
Great. Next slide, please. All right. So we have touched on, how to prepare your scope of work. Now we're ready to get into an agreement with our contractor. Um, you want to make sure that you put all your expectations into the contract. You don't want to leave them for good intentions. And some things I've categorized them here into four categories: daily cleanup and safety, look ahead scheduling, equipment and incentive approval, and documentation requirements. Um, a lot of these may feel like, it's the contractor's part of their scope of work and part of their, they've done this before, but in each of my contracts, I have noted specifically that our contractor needs to clean the site daily. No tools should be laying around. No tools should be in the tenants' homes. No tools should be left in the common areas, and that the work hours on site should be the work hours that we have approved, whether that be 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., that's the work schedule. And all areas where they're moving and storing or using common area space needs to be cleared before the end of the day. That is written out in the contract. Then you want to make sure that this work is manageable, that the contractor is not changing the schedule at the last minute. The contractor can have a backup schedule if something happens, but that they've communicated that with you, and you always want to look 1 to 2 weeks ahead. It's never perfect. The things that typically change the schedule is the equipment didn't come in on time, so you have a backup to do something else, or that the tenants are not ready for you to enter their space. So you have multiple units as backup. But this, when we first started, this was one of the most difficult things for us to manage. So you want to make sure that you're meeting weekly with your contractor and you're planning out those 1 to 2 weeks. Equipment and incentive approvals. In our case, all of our contracts have the minimum equipment requirements. So what the incentive agencies require that we sign that says we will install this equipment into the properties and the property will then be improved, or there'll be a greenhouse gas reduction of this amount. We include that into the contract with the contractors so that they can see that as well, what standards we're meeting, and they know that any equipment changes and all of the incentive programs that are supporting this work. We have started to make sure that equipment is approved before the contractor goes out and starts, and we've also made sure that the equipment is ordered before the contractor starts. I shared about documentation requirements. This is a heavy load. The project manager is doing this, but the project manager is making sure you have before and after photos, and the contractor can help take photos. If your staff can't do it, you can add it into your contract. We have it in our contract, but our project manager helps. But it means that there's two parties that are able to make sure this is getting done, and it's before and after photos. You want itemized invoices. The incentive programs require itemized invoices, which is labor, equipment, and then other materials. And so you want this for old and new equipment, and you want to make sure that you're storing that and that the contractor knows those expectations of the various incentive programs. Couple things that we have asked is the contractor, there's a code of conduct, or there's also just reminders that we've spelled out. No tools or materials can be left on tenant furniture. No use of restrooms. There are some prevailing wage requirements. You want to make sure that's also included in your contract. It may not be the entire scope of work, but it could be parts of the scope of work. What we have started to do is separate our contracts into two. It could be the same general contractor, but there will be two contracts. One that is for the prevailing wage work and one that is for the non-prevailing wage work. The contractor needs to understand their license requirements. All of this is in their contract. And then, of course, we share the minimum equipment requirements. We also ask that the contractor, before they've installed all equipment, that they are doing pre-inspections throughout the project. So for heat pump water heaters that they've installed an X number, maybe 5, they have the different inspectors. It can be the program incentive inspector, and it can be the LADBS that they've come out to see that, make sure that it's done correctly before installing the rest. So you can ask that that be part of the contract, part of the scope of work. And that you want to ask that they participate in your tenant meetings. Earlier, I shared that these are much more. There's a lot more coordination that needs to happen in these construction projects. And so, as an example, we have a project that was 4 months of construction that required 36 inspections in those 4 months. That meant that not only were our tenants there was a disruption of the work happening in their unit, but there was also the disruption of so many people coming into their unit to inspect. So you want to make sure that the contractor understands that there's going to be a lot more inspections that are going to happen in this process than they're used to. Here's a quote from one of our partners at Little Tokyo Service Center. In the future, they do need to go into each unit and measure each unit and make sure it'll work. We'd like to think all units are uniform, but they just aren't. This reminds me of our Lorena Terrace project, where we were going to install heat pump water heaters in each of our units. And the contractor went out and assessed maybe 10 of the units of the 50. We ordered all of the equipment, and when it was time to start installing, some of the closet space was very tight. We couldn't get the equipment in, which meant that then we had to order another batch of equipment. And I'll share in a bit what ultimately ended up happening. But inspecting each unit, when I shared earlier, the contractor should go into the property. They should actually be going into each of the units, and they should have a general understanding of the work that you're going to anticipate for them to do so that they know exactly what to look at. Next slide, please. Managing surprises. So I saw from the poll that unexpected is a common thing. It was also a common thing for us. But the surprises that we've encountered are, of course, grievances. You always want to have an escalation process if some grievance or something is happening. So you want to know the tenant, the project, each role needs to understand the escalation process that they should follow. There should be a general escalation process, like tenants go to the property manager informs contractor and project manager. And typically you can handle it in that way. But there may be emergencies, so you need to also have an emergency escalation process. And you need to know if there's like a cost or a shut off or something that happens, the contractor needs to be able to say, I wasn't able to get a hold of property manager. I need to urgently do this. Who's the next person that I reach out to? So make sure you've thought through that process for yourself. For us, it comes up with our tenants. Our tenants, their equipment is not working and it was just installed. How do you handle that? Or it could be that the contractor says, I have to shut off water urgently because there was an issue. How does a contractor handle that type of process? Those have come up for us. We very rarely have our tenants not happy with the work, but that's because we're having so much tenant engagement throughout the process. Your communication plan, same thing I shared earlier, is know who to call. What we expect is that we are getting weekly check-ins with our contractor. There's weekly meetings that are happening between all parties, property management, project managers, and the contractor. And then we have meetings with our tenants throughout. So you want to set up that communication plan. And then how do you handle change orders? This is where the unexpected comes in. Your contractor should have given you a bid that included the scope of work that needed to happen. You want to be aware that your contractors are not giving you low bids and then piling on changes in the process. What you want to do is reserve those change orders for true surprises or requirements that the city inspectors are asking. Throughout our construction work, we have seen where, the tenants will say, well, if you're in my unit and you're changing out or you're installing low flow aerators, why can't you change my whole faucet? They'll talk to the property manager. Property manager's like, oh, that's a great idea. Actually, you don't want the property manager to say that. You want the property manager to say, hey, this is the scope of work that we have funded. So you need to make sure that you clarified that throughout the process. And you want to make sure that the contractor knows that tenants are also going to ask for stuff and we're not making those change orders or those requests. We can talk about it at our weekly meetings and decide how we want to proceed, but you don't want to add more cost to your work because you could have true surprises that come up from your inspections. The way that you kind of manage your contractor is that you're managing their pace, their pay with their construction schedules. So the 1 week that I recommended where the team is meeting and and communicating, you use that same time frame to walk the units that have been completed so that the manager can physically verify the work is done. And when the contractor submits their pay application, you're able to proceed with that. You do want to hold back 10% retention. This is pretty standard. In some cases, it can be higher, but you want to make sure that that's also written in the contract. I should have put it on that slide. And then you want to make sure that your contractor requires, that you require lien releases from your contractor for each draw. Um, Next slide, please. I'll share a surprise with you that happened with us. So there were two surprises that we ran into for our projects. One of them was at our Vallejo property. We we were ready for final inspections with the city inspector, and they came out and they told us we're gonna require that you re-pipe the entire hot and cold water in the building. Our permit didn't ask for us to do that. It wasn't what we had planned to do. It was the city requiring because it was so outdated that we did that. It was an unexpected cost of $130,000. That was a true surprise because the incentive programs will not pay out your incentives until you close out your permit. So when we talked earlier about knowing your property and understanding the conditions or any potential surprises that can happen, also consider that or think that through. For us, we probably would have known or considered that because our tenants were constantly saying that the water pressure within their building was very low. We had to update the pipes and improve the water pressure at the building. Then the other unexpected cost we had was at Lorena Terrace. It's the one you're seeing here. We've we've moved from doing managing equipment through the construction to doing it early on before we even start construction. Um, when I shared earlier that the closet size at Lorena Terrace were all different, um, we were trying to meet incentives, and so we approved equipment or we allowed the contractor to change the equipment on that process without making sure that it was approved by the incentive programs, and we lost $40,000 in incentives. This also can be a financial strain. So for ELAC, when we think about sizing our scope of work to the incentives, we know that there's likely some replacement reserves at our property. And so if there is that unexpected, we have some sort of cushion. All right, next slide is our final slide, and this is closing out the project. I know it's only a few things on this slide, but really this takes a lot of time. This is where most of the administrative work happens. You're walking through your final site visit with all of your incentive program coordinators, and each of them most of the time want their own site visit. You are walking the entire site with the contractor before you do this with the incentive program so that you're making sure that they've checked off your punch list. You are asking that they get true warranty documentation and that the contractor is creating or helping you train your maintenance staff and your property management staff on the routine maintenance of this new equipment. And you also want to make sure that you're creating training materials for your tenants on how to use effectively their new systems. For us, we are seeing that we need to descale our heat pump water heaters. There's a lot of hard water issues. So you want to make sure that you're keeping up with that so the equipment is running effectively. And the best person to provide all these trainings is the contractor. They understand the equipment, they've installed it, and that you're doing that as part of your closeout. And I shared earlier what these reality check items were, but you can see them there. Vallejo, $130,000 unexpected costs, and Lorena Terrace, $40,000 lost in incentives. And that's it. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, we have one more slide. Top 10 occupied rehab success factors. This is really just summarizing what we clarified today. Start your permit process early, clarify your roles and responsibilities, have regular meetings, maintain tenant safety and habitability. Documentation is important for your incentives. Do your due diligence, know your building before you bid and before you consider the scope of work. Make sure that there is only one person as the point of contact for your tenants that manages all the communication. You know that they're a trusted party. Get your notices, have a standard protocol. Your equipment should be ordered and approved before you start so you don't lose any, you don't have limit your incentive risk. And that all parties understand their roles and responsibilities through this process so that you're all collaborating effectively.
Great. Thank you, Adalia. That was fantastic. We have a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions. Great. Well, this is being recorded. We will be sharing the slides. As I mentioned on retrofit.la, we're posting this plus prior webinars and filling that out with additional content and case studies. So thank you all for attending. These are always a lot of fun, and we look forward to all this coming next. Great work, Adalia, and thank you, team, all the work that went into putting this together.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.